I want to start out by reading in Galatians chapter 1. And if you listen real close to this, it will give you insight as to the lesson that we got today. Starts out with Paul saying, Paul, an apostle, not sent from men, nor through the agency of man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father, who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are with me. To the churches of Galatia, grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus Christ gave himself for our sins so that he might rescue us from this present evil age, according to the our Father, to whom be the glory forever. Amen. I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel. He's telling the Galatians this. I'm amazed that some of you are you deserting for a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. For I am now seeking the favor of men or of God, or am I striving to please men? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be the bondservant of Christ. For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel which was preached by me is not according to man. For I neither received it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through the revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. But when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went to Arabia and returned once more to Damascus. Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, which is Peter, and stayed with him 15 days. But I did not see any other apostles except for James, the Lord's brother. Now, in what I am writing to you, I assure you before God that I'm not lying. Then I went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still unknown by the sight to the churches of Judah which were in Christ. But only they kept hearing, he who once persecuted us is now preaching the faith which he once tried to destroy. And they were glorifying God because of me. Now, isn't that interesting? What Paul says about himself. What do we say about ourselves? Paul says that he changed, that he had a change in his life. Are you afraid to look in the mirror? Are you afraid that what you see is not what you want to see? Is change something that scares you a little bit? Well, let's talk about that. A woman bought this tapestry and at a craft fair, and on it was stitched these words: prayer changes things. And she was proud of this handiwork, and she hung it above the fireplace in the family room. Several days later, she noticed that it was missing. She asked her husband if he knew what had happened to it. He boldly said, "I removed it." And she said, "Well, you don't believe prayer changes things?" She was mystified. He responded, "Yes, I do believe in prayer. In fact, I believe that it changes things. I just don't happen to like change, so I took it down." Some people don't like change. If I ask you if you would like to change things back to the way they were, say 50 years ago, instead of the way they are today, what would you say? Well, you'd probably pick out the good things that was going on 50 years ago and say, that's what I want to go back to, but you'd avoid the bad things. You'd avoid the fact that we've come a long way and things are a lot more convenient. Some people don't like change. And the principal thing most people don't like to change is themselves. How many people are caught in, say, a troubled marriage and refuse to seek counseling? They would rather lose a good marriage than change. How many people caught in a cycle of chemical abuse feel desperate about their situation, but they won't seek help to change it? How many people unhappy with their lot in life try to find happiness, but they won't take one step necessary to change themselves? Changing our circumstances is one thing. Changing ourselves is another. Change is difficult. Most of us resist change even when it's to our best interest. I give you an example. Remember the old standard typewriters? I mean, big old bulky thing. Well, it's set up, the old standard typewriters are set up that the keys most used are the farthest away from each other. And it was purpose because if you remember, those keys came up like this and hit the paper or hit the ribbon, and then it printed on the paper. But I always like to get on there and go like this, and they all jammed up at the top. And then you had to pick them apart. So the whole purpose of the thing was to slow you down. And you only could go at a certain speed. Well, in the 1800s, somebody developed a simplified keyboard. Put the most used letters and symbols together and put it where the right hand did 56% of all the work. However, nobody wanted it. They denied it. It never took hold. Now progress a little further and we've come to the keyboard. And finally, the keyboard changed everything where it's up close, all of it's centered, and the periphery of the keyboard is out here where you go to the things you use least amount. So you got your both hands in the center of it and you can fly. In fact, Some people that are really good on this thing are amazing how they can look at a sheet of paper and just be going crazy with those fingers because they're so, I guess it's just natural for them to hit the right keys. It's all up here. They see it here. Their fingers do what it wants to do because it's in a grouped area like this. But see, we wouldn't accept that change years ago. We fight change pretty hard. Change is difficult. For some of us, it's more difficult than others. Some of us would rather die than change. And unfortunately, that sometimes happens. People abuse their bodies and die rather than doing something about it. People abuse their marriage partners and watch good relationships die rather than make necessary changes. People abuse their souls and watch their souls wither and die rather than to plug into the regenerating power of God's love. Change is difficult, but it's possible. And that's what Paul was telling us. He's the best evidence of that. He had been a fierce persecutor of the church. Suddenly, he became the most eloquent spokesperson. His story has been repeated millions of times throughout history. People can and do change. However, there's a progression to this. First of all, we must want to change. Here's the key to that progression. We change when it's too painful to remain as we are. How great does the pain have to be for us to change? How much tolerance do you have to have before it comes to the point where that's enough? And so we then go into the journey of changing. You know, there was an old home in Akron, Ohio that they restored years ago. It was an unpretentious home. It wasn't anything great. It's from the Depression era. It once was the home of Dr. Robert Holbrook Smith, commonly known as Dr. Bob. It was Dr. Bob who, along with Bill Wilson, created Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. This became a national historic landmark, this home, and a state historic site. And it was opened in 1985. And the house was visited by many who traveled there just to sit down at the kitchen table and have a cup of coffee where Bob, Dr. Bob, and Bill Wilson sat. It wasn't that they were sitting there drinking coffee and thinking about whatever. It was that they were both alcoholics. And they were trying to figure out what it is they had to change about themselves to not be alcoholics. Although it got off to a slow start, AA gradually grew into an international organization that has helped countless individuals achieve and maintain sobriety. There are thousands of members of Alcoholics Anonymous who can tell you that change is possible. But you have to want to change. You have to want to get rid of the pain. Few people even attempt to change unless staying like they are is more painful than the change that they have to take. How much more painful does our society have to get before we change ourselves and change our country? Ron Jensen in Leadership Magazine tells of a painful ending to an attempted ski jump. This is a story y'all remember. You turn on the TV on Saturday, and Wide World of Sports comes on. Remember Wide World of Sports? And the initial opening of the program for Wide World of Sports was a ski jumper. And if you remember, it's the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. The agony of defeat was a ski jumper that jumped. Of course, you know, you go off this thing, you jump up in the air, and you come down and land, and hopefully. But this guy wrecked right in the middle. He never got up to the lift where he went off. He ran into the sideboards and everything that they had up, and that was called the agony of defeat. Well, there's a story behind that. It wasn't this guy hit something or that he was did something irregular to his method of doing this jump. It was that he was going too fast. You see, the jump had become icy, and his speed down the slope was so fast that he knew that when he went off the lift to go up into the air, that he would go past the accepted landing zone. The landing zone being like so, where it comes down at a slope, and then it flattens out. Well, he was so fast, he would have exceeded that and went to the flat part. And that would have been like falling off of a building about 20 stories high. You see, as he explained later, the jump surface was way too fast, and it could have been fatal for him to make the jump. As it was, the skier suffered just a minor headache. The agony of defeat. Most people are not aware of their need to change. This guy was. He knew he was going too fast. Hold that thought a minute. Most people are not aware that they need to change. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy or not. Robert Wadlow. Anybody heard of Robert Wadlow? Well, Robert Wadlow was the tallest man known that could be verified, known in the world. Guinness World Book of Records. Tallest guy. 8 feet 11 inches tall. Robert lived in some small town in Illinois. In fact, he's a legend up there, and they have statues of him. Wadlow was, he had this problem. I had to ask Linda what it was before class. What'd you say it was, Linda? Pituitary gland is a growth gland, and he had one that was on steroids. By the time he was 17 years old, he was 8 foot tall. He was 7 foot tall when he was 10. He was getting it. He had, by the time he was 22 years old, he had a size 37 foot. He could lay down in bed and have to have binoculars to see if his toenails needed clipping. This guy was tall, almost 9 feet tall. He got around pretty good. He actually walked with a cane, never got into a wheelchair. He had to have braces for his legs, help keep him up. But I saw some pictures of this guy, and I mean, they always showed him with a normal size 6-foot guy. Whew! You look, and that's he was asked. He said, "Do you get tired of people staring at you?" He says, "I just overlook them." Robert died when he was 22. And the reason for it was, and this is back in the 40s, the reason for it is that he had been fitted with new braces for his legs. And one of them rubbed a blister on his ankle. He wasn't aware of it at the time, but he had lost nerve endings in his feet. And he couldn't feel that there was a blister. So it set up blood poisoning. Back in, simple antibiotics would have captured it. But he was not aware that he needed to make a change to his braces. You see, sometimes we're not aware we need to change. Sometimes we won't look in the mirror and say, this is not what God meant for me to be. We can also change, as Paul did, if we have a vision. And I'm not talking about either going to sleep and having a dream, and I'm not talking about getting hit on the head and having a vision. I'm talking about you having vision. A vision of something better that we aspire to be. Because you see, like old Flip Wilson said, what you see is what you get. Modern research into human behavior says this is true. So what if you don't see the blister? How do you know you need to change? If you're not aware you're going too fast down the slope, how do you know you need to wreck before you get to the end of the lift? Remember the movie Karate Kid? There's a scene in it in the original movie, and the main character, Daniel-san, is befriended by a wise elderly maintenance man by the name of Mr. Miyagi. Daniel goes to see Mr. Miyagi and finds him trimming this delicate bonsai tree. And Daniel's fascinated. So Miyagi tells him, hey, won't you try it? Daniel replies that he doesn't have any idea how to do it. So Miyagi encourages him to try. First, he tells Daniel to close his eyes. Then Miyagi tells Daniel to picture in his mind what he wants the tree to look like when he's finished. Daniel concentrates, and he sees all these details that he wants for the tree. Miyagi asks him if he's got the tree in his mind now. Then Miyagi says, open your eyes and begin. Daniel starts slowly to trim the tree. Every move is deliberate and focused. Then he stops. He's unsure. And he asks, How do I know if my picture is right? And Miyagi replies, if the picture comes from your heart, it must be right. Just trust your picture. People who study human behavior tell us that visualization is a powerful tool for people who want to change. If you can see yourself as being slim and trim, then you can probably become slim and trim. If you can see yourself as successful, that picture will guide you to making better choices. Of course, there's limits to this. Visualizing yourself as 9 feet tall will not make you 9 feet tall. Still, seeing ourselves as we might be, as God created us to be, can motivate us to change. Have you ever given any thought as to what God wanted you to be? Is it what you are? That's why every follower of Jesus ought to have in mind a picture of Jesus, not the physical picture, not what people have thought he looked like as a Jew in his time. Not the appearance, but the kind of man he was. His gentleness, his patience and acceptance, but also his willingness to stand for his convictions. Willingness to stand for what you believe may not be as dramatic as Paul's experience on the road to Damascus. However, it may become very real very soon. Christ's willingness to lay down his life to others for others, it is the picture of Jesus that has caused millions of people to rise to new levels of humanity. Lord, I want to be like Jesus, says the old spiritual. And that is a key to a changed life. We can change if we want to. We can change if we have a mental image of the kind of person God created us to be. Most of all, though, change comes when we surrender our will to God. Perhaps Paul was ready for a change. As he held the robes of the men who were stoning Stephen, perhaps Paul knew deep down that Stephen was right and he was wrong. We know after his blinding vision, he had a mental image of Christ because he urges us to conform to that image in our own lives. The important thing about Paul's life is that he was totally surrendered to the will of God. His conversion was complete. It wasn't simply a product of a New Year's resolution or a naive desire to somehow live a better life. It was unconditional surrender to God, and that's the way complete change occurs. In Galations 1, verse 11 and 12, Paul says, I neither received it of man, neither was I taught it, but it came by the revelation of Jesus Christ. Many of you might say, I'm too old to change. I'm set in my ways. You're never too old. You're never too old to get better than what you are. E. Stanley Jones once said that He had seen missionaries leave loved ones, friends, home, business, prospects, and come to other lands and find that they had given up everything except themselves. Given up everything except self. Self was still there, assertive and jealous of its place and of honor. The greatest battle any of us undertake in this life is the battle with self. There's no other way except surrender. Complete and unconditional surrender to the will of God. Such surrender requires a lifelong journey. It takes a life to get there. We're that stubborn. A teenage girl was in high school, and her assignment was to write a poem. She worked for about 3 or 4 hours one night trying to write this poem, and what she finally came up with was this. Although 3 hours it costed, I'm still not Robert Frosted. Her journey to becoming a poet may be longer than she anticipated. Change generally doesn't come in 3 hours. It can, but generally it doesn't. Change usually is the product of a lifelong commitment, but it's worth the price, particularly the change involved in moving from the world of darkness to the world of light, from despair to hope, and from death to life. We change when it's too painful to remain as we are. Jack Nicholson played a troubled man who needed to take some risk to change his miserable condition. You're all probably familiar with this. He asked this question: is there more, or is this as good as it gets? Which became the name of the movie. Well, as many of you know, that movie was about a man that changed. And he changed because he asked himself that question. I don't know if many of you like Ann Landers and all the stuff she wrote in years past, but she carried a little piece of paper around with her, and it was an anonymous author to this little piece of paper, and she always carried it with her wherever she went. It was entitled Dilemma. And it said, to laugh is to risk appearing a fool. To weep is a risk of appearing sentimental. To reach out for another is a risk of involvement. To expose feelings is a risk of rejection. To place your dreams before the crowd is a risk of ridicule. To love is a risk of not being loved in return. To go forward in the face of overwhelming odds is a risk of failure. But risk must be taken, because the greatest hazard in life is to risk nothing. The person who risks nothing, does nothing, has nothing, is nothing. He may avoid suffering and sorrow, but he cannot learn, feel, change, grow, or love. Changed by his certitudes, he is a slave. Only a person who takes risk are truly free. I don't know how many of you are baseball fans, but as I talked to you about Wide World of Sports, this goes back some time. It's about Earl Weaver. He was the manager of the Baltimore Orioles, and that's not a Nature Society thing. It's a baseball team that was in Maryland. Earl Weaver had this thing where when the game wasn't going good and the umpire was calling bad calls, he'd come flying out of the dugout. And you got to visualize this. Weaver's a little fat guy. He come flying out of the dugout. I mean, he was having a slobbering fit. And he runs up to umpire and gets this close to him. And one of his favorite things he said to the umpire, and usually got him thrown out of the game, was, "Are you going to get any better? Or is this it?" Are you going to get any better, ump? Or is this it? Maybe God's asking us the same question. Maybe we're asking ourselves the same question. Are you going to change, or is this it? We can change if we really want to. We can change if we fix our eyes on Jesus. We can change if we are willing to surrender our lives completely to God. I surrender all. You know that song. You've heard it over the years. The only thing you are in control of in this life is your attitude. Be it positive or negative or complacent, you're in charge. Is your life now as good as it gets? On the other side, in the sweet by and by, it is exponentially better than this. The journey to get there is the difference between flying coach and flying first class. And the cost is just a little change. And all God's people said,